You already knew dinner was ready before she called your name. You knew it the second that cast iron lid rattled, when the smell hit the hallway, and you dropped whatever you were doing without being told. Here are 30 easy childhood dinners that taste better than you remember. Swiss steak was on the table before the word braising entered anyone's vocabulary. She took a cheap round steak, the cut nobody else wanted, laid it on the counter, and drove a meat mallet into it until the flour disappeared into the surface. Then it went into a heavy pan, browned on both sides, and buried under canned tomatoes and sliced onions. The lid went on. The oven went low. 2 hours later, that kitchen smelled like something that cost far more than it did. The name had nothing to do with Switzerland. Swissing was the tenderizing technique, the process of pounding a cheap cut into submission. Reynolds Wrap Aluminum spread the recipe in the late 1940s by suggesting home cooks line the pan with foil for easy cleanup, and suddenly it was in Better Homes and Gardens, community cookbooks, church bulletins. Round steak was 50 cents a pound. The gravy it made, thick and rust red, rich with rendered fat, was worth 10 times that on a winter Tuesday. You can find the recipe anywhere. You cannot find the hands that made it taste like that. Pork chops on a school night meant she started with the onions, sliced thick and pushed around in bacon drippings until they went deep brown at the edges, filling the kitchen with something that made your stomach tighten before you sat down. The chops went in bone-in, browned hard on both sides, then the onions went back on top with a splash of water, lid on, low heat for 45 minutes. Smothered pork chops showed up on weeknight tables across the South and Midwest because bone-in loin chops were among the cheapest cuts at the butcher counter through the 1950s and 60s, and because the smothering technique turned a tough chop into something that fell apart on the fork. She never measured the water. She added it by sound, by whether the pan was still hissing the way it was supposed to. That was the whole lesson. Stuffed bell peppers looked like they required planning. Company food dressed up as everyday food. Peppers hollowed out with a spoon, filled with ground beef, rice, and canned tomatoes, then set in a baking dish and slid into a moderate oven until the tops browned and the peppers softened. The dish made sense in the post-war years because it used everything efficiently. Beef stretched further with rice, the pepper was the container, the tomato sauce baked in. Families who moved to the suburbs in the 1950s found it on the back of the Hunt's tomato sauce can, in church recipe swaps, in the Better Homes and Gardens cookbook. What varied from kitchen to kitchen was the seasoning: Worcestershire in one house, garlic powder and dried oregano in another, plain salt and pepper in the next. You knew a good one by the smell through the oven door, beef and tomato going caramel at the edges, the pepper releasing its sweetness into the sauce below. The smell told you. You didn't need the clock. Scalloped potatoes with ham required no announcement. Thin sliced raw potatoes, each one translucent enough to see through if held to the light, layered into a buttered baking dish with chopped leftover ham, a scattering of flour, salt, and enough whole milk to come almost to the top. Into a slow oven for an hour and a half until the milk thickened into cream sauce and the top layer of potato went golden and the edges pulled away from the dish. This was the dish that solved Monday. The ham bone from Sunday went into the navy beans, and whatever ham remained went here. Pennsylvania Dutch families had been making versions since the 1800s brought from Germany and adapted to the root cellars and dairy farms of the Mid-Atlantic, and by the 1940s it was a staple from Ohio to Oregon. You knew it was done when a knife slid through the top with no resistance. You didn't set a timer, you paid attention. If scalloped potatoes made Monday manageable, American goulash, or Johnny Marzetti, depending on which side of Ohio you grew up on, made Wednesday disappear entirely. Elbow macaroni, browned ground beef, canned tomatoes, cooked together in one pot until the pasta absorbed most of the sauce and everything went sticky at the edges. The name came from Teresa Marzetti, who ran a restaurant in Columbus, Ohio in the 1920s and served a baked version that spread through Midwest community cookbooks and school cafeteria programs for 50 years. By the 1950s, some version appeared on nearly every school lunch tray in the state. Johnny Marzetti in Ohio. American chop suey in New England, goulash everywhere else. The same dish, renamed by whoever got there first. At home, the trick was in the waiting. Right off the stove, it was good. The next day, cold from the refrigerator with the macaroni swollen and the sauce thickened into something almost solid, it was better. The kids who knew that were the ones who got there first in the morning. Salmon patties on Friday nights were not optional, and not because anyone particularly loved them. Before Vatican II relaxed the rules in the early 1960s, Catholic families, and many households that simply followed the custom by habit, kept Friday as a meatless day. Canned salmon was the answer. It came from the Alaska and Pacific Northwest canneries operating since the 1880s, packed in flat oval tins at a price within reach of almost any household. You drained the liquid, mashed in the soft spine bones because your mother knew they were calcium, combined the salmon with cracker crumbs, beaten egg, a little onion, salt, and pepper, formed patties, and fried them in a cast iron skillet until both sides were deeply browned. Crisp on the outside, soft in the middle, smelling like the sea in a way that felt out of place in a landlocked kitchen. She made tartar sauce from scratch, mayonnaise, pickle relish, a squeeze of lemon if there was one. Every Friday, without variation, without complaint, without a recipe card in sight. Creamed chipped beef on toast had a name that polite company didn't repeat, and the soldiers who ate it in mess halls from the First World War through Korea knew exactly what that name was. The Army had been serving dried, salt-cured beef, shaved thin and folded into white gravy, butter, flour, and milk, since the early 1900s, when it needed a high-protein, shelf-stable staple it could produce in bulk. When the men came home, a generation of wives learned to make it because their husbands asked. The dried beef came in small glass jars at the grocery, packed by Armour or Hormel, paper-thin slices folded like damp pages. You soaked them briefly to pull some of the salt, added them to the roux at the last minute, let the sauce coat every piece. Spooned over thick white toast, it filled you in the way only cheap food can, the kind that sits in you for hours. By the 1970s, it had largely left the family table, but one smell of that buttery salt on toast and 40 years disappear. Navy bean and ham bone soup started the night before, always, because dried beans were not something you rushed. A pound of navy beans went into a pot covered with cold water and left on the counter overnight, swelling in the dark. The ham bone from Sunday went in the next morning with the soaked beans covered with fresh water, set on the back burner to simmer all day. No recipe, no ratio. You added an onion, a bay leaf, maybe a carrot if one was in the cold box. By 4 in the afternoon, the broth had gone deep and cloudy and the meat had come off the bone in long shreds. You fished out the bone, pulled the meat, stirred it back in, salted until it was right. Ham and bean soup was Monday in the South and Midwest for generations, built on the understanding that Sunday's celebration fed Tuesday's working week and that nothing left the kitchen until it had given everything it had. Porcupine meatballs earned their name honestly. Raw, long-grain rice pressed into the ground beef before cooking, so as the meatballs simmered, the grains pushed through the surface like quills, swelling as they absorbed the liquid. The idea came from the Depression, when families needed to stretch a pound of ground beef as far as possible. Rice doubled the volume of the meatballs and gave the dish a texture somehow better than plain beef. The rice absorbed the tomato sauce from the inside out, cooking in it rather than alongside it. Most families used a can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup thinned with water, which gave the sauce a sweetness that scratch tomato couldn't replicate. You dropped the raw meatballs into the simmering liquid without browning them first. That was the trick, the part that looked wrong to anyone who hadn't been taught. Browning first would have set the rice before it could expand. The kids who knew that were the ones whose grandmothers had made these during the Depression and never stopped. Sunday spaghetti in American kitchens had almost nothing to do with Italy and everything to do with what happened to Italian cooking when it crossed the ocean and hit a country where beef was cheap and tomatoes came in cans. Italian immigrants had made their Sunday gravy with pork bones and sausage, a long simmered sauce that took most of the day. By the 1950s, when the sauce had spread to non-Italian households through neighborhoods and church friends and the back of the Hunt's tomato can, the pork bones had been replaced with ground beef browned in a skillet and stirred directly in. It still simmered for hours. That part wasn't negotiable. You started it after lunch on Sunday and let it go until supper, the whole house filling with the smell of tomatoes cooking down into something deep and almost sweet. Served over spaghetti with a piece of white bread to push things around the plate, it fed 6 people on 2 pounds of meat and a few cans of tomatoes. The sauce always tasted better the next day. Everyone knew that. Nobody waited. Before any family had a recipe for it, there were other kitchens, immigrant kitchens in Chicago and Detroit and Pittsburgh, where dinner was assembled from memory carried across an ocean. Stuffed cabbage rolls, which Polish families called golubki, and Ukrainian families called holubtsi, and Czech families called holubki, came to American industrial cities with Central European immigrants in the late 1800s. Cabbage leaves softened in boiling water until pliable, filled with ground beef and raw rice, rolled tight, layered in a heavy pot, covered with tomato sauce, and left to braise for hours. The rice cooked inside the rolls, absorbing the sauce, pushing the meat outward until each roll was firm and sliceable. The rolls on the bottom of the pot got the most caramelization from the sauce, and those were the ones everyone quietly tried to claim. If you got the bottom rolls, you didn't say anything. You just knew. City chicken had no chicken in it, which was the whole point of the name. In Pittsburgh and Cleveland and Detroit, in the Polish and Ukrainian neighborhoods that grew up around the steel mills in the 1930s and 40s, fresh chicken cost more per pound than pork shoulder or veal. So butcher counters in those neighborhoods sold cubed pork and veal already threaded on wooden skewers, shaped roughly to resemble a drumstick, and working families took them home, breaded them in seasoned flour and egg and breadcrumbs, browned them in a skillet, then finished them covered in the oven with a little broth. The imitation that tasted good enough that people stopped thinking of it as imitation. By the 1950s, it appeared in junior league cookbooks from Pennsylvania to Illinois under its real name, no longer embarrassed by its origins. The pork stayed juicy under the breading. The veal, when you could find it, went silky at the center. You pulled it off the stick with your teeth, and nobody called it anything other than dinner. Chicken fricassee arrived in American kitchens wearing a French name and hiding the fact that it was simply stewed chicken in cream gravy, which made it more appealing, not less. The dish had French Acadian roots that ran through Louisiana and up through the mid-Atlantic states, but by the time it reached the average household in the 1940s and 50s, it had been stripped of its regional accent and turned into something any home cook could manage on a Wednesday. You cut a whole chicken into pieces, browned them in butter, then added flour to the drippings, stock, and a cup of cream. Covered and simmered low for 40 minutes until the meat was fall-apart tender and the sauce had thickened to something you wanted to soak a biscuit in. Served over egg noodles or rice, it fed a family of 5 without cost or complaint. It disappeared quietly when boneless chicken breasts became the default cut in the 1980s and nobody had a whole bird to start with anymore. Chicken pot pie made from scratch was a different creature from the one that came in a foil tray, and anyone who grew up eating the real thing knows what the difference was. The crust, lard and flour and cold water, cut together until the fat was in pea-sized pieces that would puff into layers in the oven, was mixed on the counter and pressed into the dish by hand. The filling was leftover chicken pulled from the bone in rough pieces, combined with diced carrots, peas, and a white sauce made from chicken broth and cream. Into a moderate oven for 45 minutes until the crust went golden. Swanson's frozen pot pie hit grocery stores in 1951 and changed the category forever. Within a decade, most households had stopped making the scratch version. The lard crust shattered when you cut it. The frozen one bent. That was the difference, and it was not a small one. Ham loaf arrived without fanfare and left people looking for more before they understood what they'd eaten. Ground ham combined with raw pork shoulder, packed into a loaf pan, and covered with a glaze of brown sugar and dry mustard that caramelized in the oven into something dark and almost candy-like at the edges. It was built from surplus, the holiday ham ground down, extended with fresh pork for fat and moisture. And it was common enough in Pennsylvania and Midwestern communities through the 1950s and 60s to appear in nearly every church and junior league cookbook of the era. The glaze was the secret. 2 parts brown sugar to 1 part dry mustard, moistened with a little cider vinegar, applied twice during the bake, so the last coat had time to set to a lacquer. If you knew to apply it twice, you'd been taught by someone who knew what they were doing. Most people only applied it once. You could tell by the color. Tamale pie was not tamales, and it made no apology for that. A spiced ground beef filling, onion, garlic, canned tomatoes, chili powder, a little cumin, spread into a baking dish and covered with a cornmeal crust that baked into something between thick polenta and a cornbread lid. The concept arrived in California in the early 1900s through Sunset magazine recipes that tried to simplify traditional tamale preparation for home cooks who didn't have the equipment or the extended family to make real tamales in quantity. By the 1940s, it had spread east through home economics classes and school cafeteria programs, landing in Midwestern and Southern kitchens far from any Mexican cooking tradition. Kids who grew up eating it in school cafeterias rarely knew its California origins. They just knew it was the day the line moved fast and people came back for seconds. It vanished from most tables by the 1980s when Tex-Mex restaurants started appearing in the suburbs. Creamed peas and new potatoes arrived at the table for about 3 weeks out of the year, and those 3 weeks were the point. Early summer, when the peas were still sweet and barely past the size of a child's thumbnail, and the new potatoes could be skinned by rubbing them under cold water with your thumb. Those 2 things went into a thin cream sauce made from butter, flour, and whole milk, and served while the peas were still bright. The dish existed only during the narrow window when both overlapped in the garden, which made it unrepeatable and anticipated. Frozen peas ended the urgency in the 1960s. Once you could make it anytime, people mostly stopped making it at all. She always made it the first Tuesday after she pulled the first potatoes. You could set a calendar by it. Stuffed tomatoes were August on a plate. Large, ripe summer tomatoes hollowed out with a spoon, the insides chopped and combined with stale bread, dried herbs, a little butter-softened onion, then packed back in and baked until the filling set, and the tomato softened without losing its shape. The dish showed up in Depression-era home economics guides as a way to use both surplus garden tomatoes and day-old bread in a single step, and Italian immigrant communities had been making versions, pomodori ripieni, since the early 1900s. In American households through the 1940s and 50s, it became a light supper, set beside a piece of cold ham or a fried egg, requiring almost nothing to prepare and producing something that looked far more considered than it was. The tomato had to be ripe enough to yield. The bread had to be stale enough to absorb. A fresh loaf turned to paste. You used what was left from the week. Creamed corn was not a can you opened, not in a kitchen that understood the difference. Real creamed corn started with a sharp knife run down a fresh ear, cutting halfway through the kernels, then the back of the blade scraped down again to milk the cob, pulling out the liquid starch that sat inside each cut kernel. Southern and Midwestern farm families had been doing this through the summer months for generations, taking the surplus sweet corn that arrived faster than it could be eaten fresh. The scraped corn went into a heavy skillet with butter and a little cream, stirred over medium heat until it thickened, salted until it tasted like itself. No flour, no cornstarch. The thickening came from the corn's own starch. If you hadn't scraped the cob twice, you got a different dish. Thinner, less sweet, missing the particular silkiness that came from that second pass. She knew which ears were right for it by feel. Heavy for their size, the silk still pale. But if creamed corn marked the peak of summer, Saturday night baked beans marked something older and more deliberate, a tradition requiring 2 full days and tolerating no shortcuts. New England families had been slow-baking dried navy beans with salt pork, molasses, and dry mustard since the colonial era, the practice tied to the Puritan prohibition on Sunday cooking. The beans, soaked overnight Friday, went into the bean pot Saturday morning with a slab of salt pork, molasses, and dry mustard. Into a low oven, uncovered for the last hour so the top beans developed a skin, and the pork rind crisped. The smell built through the house all day, deep, sweet, slightly smoky, so that by supper time it had become inseparable from the idea of Saturday itself. You made them in a ceramic bean pot if you had one, a Dutch oven if you didn't. Either way, the house smelled like a home by afternoon. Corned beef and cabbage on a Monday night was not a celebration, it was a transaction. The brisket had arrived at the house already salted and cured, packed in its own brine from the corner butcher's case, and it went into a large pot, brought to a boil, the first water poured off to pull some of the salt, then covered again and simmered for 3 hours. The cabbage went in during the last 40 minutes, cut in wedges, along with quartered potatoes and thick rounds of carrot. Irish-American working families had built this meal around corned beef brisket rather than the bacon back ribs used in Ireland, a substitution made in the late 1800s when Irish immigrants found beef cheaper than pork in American cities and salt-cured brisket available from Jewish butchers in their neighborhoods. By the 1950s, it was no longer thought of as immigrant food. It was simply Monday, practical and filling, the kind of dinner that asked nothing of the cook and gave everything to the table. Chicken and wild rice hot dish was the church supper in Minnesota and North Dakota. Not just a casserole, but the thing families brought when someone had a baby or lost a job or came home from the hospital, the dish that appeared on the counter without being asked. Cooked chicken pulled from the bone, combined with wild rice and bound together with cream of mushroom soup and a little broth, baked until the rice absorbed everything and the top set. The wild rice gave it something no white rice could replicate, a firm, slightly chewy bite that held its texture even after an hour in the oven. A nutty depth from the grain itself, manoomin, the grain the Ojibwe had been harvesting from the lakes of the Great Lakes region for centuries, brought in a covered dish, left on the counter, eaten without ceremony, because ceremony wasn't the point. Showing up was. Chicken fried steak had a name that told you exactly what it was and a history that explained exactly why. In Central Texas and across Oklahoma, German immigrant settlers in the late 1800s had brought with them the schnitzel technique, pounding a thin cutlet, dredging it in seasoned flour, frying it hard, and applied it to the cheap round steak available at the ranch butcher rather than the veal they'd used back home. The white pepper cream gravy that covered it was the American edition, built from the pan drippings, thickened with flour, finished with whole milk until it stood a spoon. It became the working man's answer to a steak dinner, something that looked like a restaurant plate and cost what a family could afford on a Friday. You pounded the steak yourself until the fibers broke and the surface was rough enough for the flour to grip. The first side went down in hot oil and you did not touch it until it released on its own. If you lifted it too soon, the crust pulled away. That was the part nobody put in a recipe. You had to be shown. Stuffed pork shoulder arrived at the Sunday table smelling like something that had been thinking about you all day. A bone-in fresh pork shoulder was slit open along the bone, packed with a stuffing of stale bread, sautéed onion, sage, and celery, then tied closed and set in a roasting pan. Into a slow oven for 3 to 4 hours until the outside had colored deeply and the stuffing had absorbed everything from within. The tradition came from German-American households in Pennsylvania and the Mid-Atlantic states, where a stuffed fresh pork shoulder appeared regularly in Lutheran and Mennonite church cookbooks from the 1930s through the 1960s. The stuffing was never precise. Stale bread, whatever fresh herbs were available, salt, pepper, enough butter to bind. You stuffed it the morning before it went in. You timed it by feel rather than temperature, because that was how it had always been done and the thermometer hadn't been part of it yet. By the time those big Sunday roasts gave way to weeknight shortcuts, something else was already slipping away with them. The Monday pot that started from bones. Beef vegetable soup made from marrow bones was not a recipe so much as a commitment. You went to the butcher for soup bones, put them in a cold pot with cold water, brought it slowly to a boil, skimmed the foam, then let it go for 3 hours until the broth had color and body. Then the vegetables. Whatever was in the root cellar, potatoes, carrots, parsnips, onions, a can of tomatoes, the last of the cabbage. Another hour. The marrow dissolved into the broth, which was the whole point. That depth, that unctuousness, that thing no bouillon cube could replicate. She made it when someone was sick. She made it when money was short. She made it on Mondays because the bones were there and because she knew how. The recipe died with her, the way recipes always die. Not all at once, but slowly, the year nobody asked her to write it down. Pan-fried creek trout was not a dish you planned. It was a dish you caught. In Appalachian communities and the rural Midwest, fishing local streams for brook or rainbow trout was a regular part of how families put protein on the table through spring and summer. You cleaned the fish at the kitchen sink, left them whole, dredged them in yellow cornmeal seasoned with salt and pepper, and fried them in a cast-iron skillet in bacon drippings, always bacon drippings, because the fat contributed flavor the fish needed. The cornmeal crust crisped to something almost brittle at the tail and fin edges. You ate them with your hands, pulling the meat away from the spine. A piece of white bread to soak up the pan drippings. A sliced tomato from the garden if it was July. For the families who lived that way, it was not a simple dinner. It was a complete world that has since gone very quiet. Beef stew with dropped dumplings was a farmhouse one-pot meal that solved everything a cold evening could present. Bone-in beef, chuck or shin, whatever the butcher had that week at a price that made sense, went into a heavy pot, simmered low for an hour and a half until the meat was beginning to yield, then thick-cut carrots and quartered potatoes went in until the broth had thickened from the potato starch. The dumplings came last. Flour, baking powder, salt, a little fat, enough milk to make a thick batter, dropped by spoonfuls onto the surface of the simmering stew, lid on, 15 minutes without lifting it. You did not lift the lid. If you lifted the lid, the dumplings fell. Every child who grew up around this meal learned that rule first. They absorbed the stew from below and steamed from above and came out pillowy and dense at the center, tasting of everything in the pot. She made it when the temperature dropped. You never needed to be told when that was. Ham and beans was Monday in the Appalachian Highlands and across the rural South, and the word recipe doesn't quite apply to something understood before anyone thought to write it down. Dried pinto beans, or Great Northern beans, or October beans if you were in the mountains of western North Carolina, soaked overnight, then set on the back of the stove all morning with a ham hock buried at the center, the lid on, the heat low, nobody watching. By noon, the broth had gone cloudy, and the ham had given up everything it had into the pot. You pulled the meat from the hock, stirred it back in, seasoned with salt and a little black pepper. Served with a square of cornbread. Not sweet, never sweet in that tradition, just yellow cornmeal and buttermilk in a hot cast-iron skillet. The beans and the bread made a complete meal that cost almost nothing and fed whoever showed up. People showed up. They always showed up for this. Homemade egg noodles and chicken broth were the meal she made when someone was sick, and that was not the whole story. She made them because she had always made them. Because her mother had made them. Because in the Mennonite and Amish farmhouse kitchens of Indiana and Ohio and Pennsylvania, this was simply what noodles were. 2 eggs beaten into a well of flour on the board, worked into a stiff dough, rested, then rolled and cut into strips by hand, thick enough to have some give when you bit through, and dropped into rich chicken broth simmering since morning. The noodles absorbed the broth as they cooked and gave back starch that thickened it slightly, so the finished dish was somewhere between a soup and something more substantial. There was no box version that tasted like this. The dried noodles from the grocery went softer, lost the texture of a hand-rolled noodle cut by someone who knew how thick was right. She knew. You knew it too, the first time you tried to make them yourself and couldn't quite get there. Fried cornmeal mush was the end of one meal becoming the beginning of the next, and the whole philosophy of these kitchens lived inside that simple fact. Cornmeal porridge made for supper was poured into a loaf pan and left in the cold box overnight until solid. The next evening, you sliced it into half-inch rounds, laid them in a cast-iron skillet in bacon fat, and let them go untouched over medium heat until a crust formed that was genuinely crisp, almost like a cracker, the soft cornmeal interior still giving under pressure. both sides, stacked on a plate with butter and a little molasses. The dish showed up in Appalachian households, in Midwestern farm families, in African-American Depression-era kitchens, in Italian-American homes where it was called polenta frita and served the same way for the same reasons. Nothing wasted. The cold made hot again. She is gone now, and so is the cold box where the mush set overnight. What remains is the shape of the meal, the knowledge that yesterday's supper can still become today's best dinner. Wilted lettuce with hot bacon dressing transformed garden greens into something entirely different from cold salad. Grandma would fry thick-cut bacon until crispy, then remove it and pour a splash of cider vinegar into the sizzling hot grease. The mixture would pop and sputter dangerously, filling the kitchen with sharp, smoky fragrance. She added a pinch of sugar by feel, stirred quickly, then poured the hot dressing over a bowl of tender leaf lettuce just picked from the garden. The leaves wilted immediately, becoming silky and infused with bacon flavor while still retaining some fresh crunch. The crumbled bacon was scattered on top, sometimes with sliced hard-boiled eggs. This dish existed only in spring when lettuce was young and tender, before summer heat turned it bitter. Grandma made it entirely by instinct. How much vinegar depended on how tart she wanted it, how much sugar on the lettuce's bitterness that day. The salad was eaten immediately, while still warm, a fleeting pleasure that couldn't be saved. Tomato gravy started the same way Sawmill gravy did. Bacon drippings in a hot skillet, a spoonful of flour stirred in. But where Sawmill gravy reached for milk, tomato gravy reached for the canning jar. Home-canned tomatoes, crushed by hand into the roux, turned the gravy a deep orange red and gave it a sweetness that the pepper-heavy Sawmill version never had. A pinch of sugar went in if the tomatoes were too sharp, and the gravy cooked down until it was thick enough to sit on a split biscuit without running off the edges. Across the rural South through the 1940s and 50s, tomato gravy was breakfast, served alongside whatever the kitchen could produce: eggs if the hens were laying, a slice of cured ham if the smokehouse still had one. The color told you what kind of morning it was. Pale gravy meant milk was plentiful. Red gravy meant the cow had gone dry and the tomatoes were filling in. Soft-boiled eggs with toast soldiers turned a simple egg into an interactive meal that brought small pleasure to solitary dining. Seniors who grew up with this British-influenced tradition continued preparing it well into later years, finding comfort in the familiar ritual. The egg was lowered gently into boiling water and cooked for exactly 3 to 4 minutes, producing set white and gloriously runny yolk. Meanwhile, toast was prepared and cut into narrow strips called soldiers, ready for dipping. The egg sat in a small cup, its top carefully removed to reveal golden liquid within. Each toast soldier was dipped into the yolk, emerging coated in rich goodness that made plain bread taste extraordinary. The meal cost almost nothing yet felt ceremonial, requiring attention that gave structure to evenings that might otherwise blur together. For seniors eating alone, the process of dipping and eating provided small entertainment alongside nourishment. Cornmeal mush and molasses was the breakfast that cost almost nothing but provided everything a body needed to face hard work. Grandma would boil water in a heavy pot, then slowly stream coarse cornmeal into the bubbling liquid while stirring constantly with a wooden spoon worn smooth from decades of use. The mixture had to cook slowly, requiring patience to prevent lumps or scorching. When it reached the right thickness, something only her hands knew, she spooned it steaming into bowls and drizzled thick blackstrap molasses over the top. The combination of corn's earthiness and molasses' mineral-rich sweetness created something that tasted like sustenance itself. Children ate it before school. Men ate it before dawn chores. The leftover mush was poured into loaf pans, chilled until firm, sliced, and fried in bacon grease for supper. Nothing was wasted. The dish demanded no recipe because the proportions lived in muscle memory, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter through watching, not reading. Fried potatoes and onions cooked in saved bacon grease was a meal that appeared on tables across the Appalachian South 3 or 4 nights a week. Potatoes sliced thin, a rough chopped onion, and a heavy spoonful of drippings from that jar. all pressed flat in a cast-iron skillet and cooked without stirring until the bottom turned golden and crisp. You flipped it in sections, not all at once, and the onions went sweet and dark against the edges of the potatoes. In the 1950s, a 10-pound bag of potatoes cost around 35 cents, and a single bag could stretch across a full week of suppers. The grease was free, saved from breakfast, from Sunday's fatback, from every strip of bacon that ever touched that pan. Nobody measured. You scooped until the skillet looked right. That instinct died with the women who owned those jars. Welsh rarebit in its quick version brought pub-style comfort to kitchen tables, requiring only cheese, milk, and toast to create something surprisingly sophisticated. Seniors who remembered this dish from earlier decades simplified the traditional recipe into something achievable in under 10 minutes. Sharp cheddar was grated and melted slowly in a small saucepan with a splash of milk, dash of Worcestershire sauce, and sometimes pinch of dry mustard. The mixture was stirred until smooth, then spooned generously over toast placed on a plate. The cheese sauce pooled around bread, creating a dish part soup and part sandwich, eaten with knife and fork. The flavors were bold and savory, the texture rich and comforting. For seniors eating alone, Welsh rarebit felt like treating yourself to something special without leaving home or spending much money. This dish transformed ordinary pantry ingredients into something that tasted like care and intention. Dumplings and wild greens was the spring celebration meal when foraged foods meant fresh nutrition after months of preserved vegetables. Grandma would gather whatever was ready: dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, wild mustard, washing them thoroughly in multiple water changes. The greens simmered with salt pork until tender, their pot liquor becoming rich and slightly bitter. Meanwhile, she mixed dumpling dough by feel: flour, a bit of lard, enough liquid to hold together, then dropped spoonfuls directly into the bubbling greens. The dumplings puffed and cooked through, absorbing the flavors of greens and pork. This dish required knowing which wild plants were edible when they were tender enough to eat, and how to cook dumplings that were light rather than leaden. No measurements existed because the greens varied every gathering, and Grandma's hands knew what her eyes confirmed. It tasted like the earth waking up, like survival, like spring itself served in a bowl. But before anything could be stretched or seasoned, someone had to know what was safe to eat from the ground, and poke sallet was the test that separated mountain cooks from everyone else. Phytolacca americana, pokeweed, grew wild along fence rows and ditch banks across the Appalachian South, and in early spring the young shoots were one of the first greens available to families who had eaten nothing fresh since autumn. The plant was toxic if handled wrong. You boiled the leaves 3 separate times, draining and replacing the water each round to pull the poison out before the greens were safe to eat. After the 3rd boil, you fried them in bacon grease with salt, and they turned dark, tender, and rich, tasting like a cross between spinach and asparagus. Cherokee and rural Appalachian families had been preparing poke this way for generations, and the knowledge passed by standing at the stove, not from any book. One wrong step, skipping a boil, picking leaves too mature, and the dish could make you sick. You either knew how or you didn't touch it. Bread and milk bowl was perhaps the oldest and simplest supper in the American pantry, dating back centuries and persisting through every economic hardship. Seniors who remembered harder times often returned to this dish when cooking seemed too effortful and appetites had shrunk with age. The preparation required nothing more than tearing bread into pieces, placing them in a bowl, and pouring cold or warm milk over the top. Sugar was sprinkled according to taste, transforming the humble combination into something approaching dessert. Some preferred their bread and milk warm, heating the milk gently before pouring. Others liked it cold, especially during summer months. The bread softened quickly, becoming easy to eat with a spoon, gentle on sensitive stomachs and aging teeth. This was food stripped to its essence. For seniors eating alone, bread and milk represented self-sufficiency and comfort of familiar flavors, asking nothing and giving everything a tired body needed. Chicken and slick dumplings was Sunday dinner comfort that required no recipe, only patience and hands that knew dough. Grandma would simmer a whole chicken for hours until the meat fell from the bones, creating rich golden broth that filled the kitchen with promise. She pulled the meat into shreds and returned it to the pot while mixing dumpling dough from flour, chicken fat, salt, and just enough broth to hold together. Rolled thin on a floured board and cut into strips, these slick dumplings went into the bubbling pot where they cooked into silky ribbons that soaked up chicken flavor. The result was neither soup nor stew, but something in between. Thick, hearty, and deeply satisfying. Every grandmother's dumplings tasted different because every grandmother's hands worked differently, rolling thicker or thinner. This was cold weather food, sick day food, company's coming food. The technique passed through watching, through standing beside Grandma at the counter, through years of practice. The sound came first, a sharp hiss when hot bacon grease hit raw greens, and then the smell of vinegar rising in a cloud of steam that filled the kitchen before the plate reached the table. Kilt lettuce, sometimes called killed lettuce, was the Appalachian way of turning raw leaf lettuce into something warm and wilted and dressed all at once. You picked the lettuce fresh from the garden, leaf lettuce, never iceberg, piled it in a bowl, and poured a hot dressing of bacon grease, apple cider vinegar, and a pinch of sugar directly over the raw leaves. The heat wilted them instantly, and you ate it before it cooled, because Kilt lettuce that sat too long turned limp and sad. The window between too small and too bitter lasted only a few weeks. You didn't need a calendar. The lettuce told you when it was ready. Stewed tomatoes on toast brought garden flavor to supper tables using canned tomatoes that cost pennies and required almost no preparation. Seniors who had canned their own tomatoes during summer or purchased store brands during lean times understood this humble ingredient's versatility. The tomatoes were heated in a small saucepan with butter, salt, sugar, and sometimes torn bread pieces that thickened the liquid into something approaching sauce. This warm mixture was spooned over buttered toast that soaked up the juices gratefully. The combination provided vitamins, fiber, and comfort of something warm and savory. Some seniors added black pepper or Worcestershire sauce to deepen flavors. Others kept things simple, letting tomatoes speak for themselves. The dish appeared on tables across America during decades when making do meant making delicious from almost nothing. Stewed tomatoes on toast proved that a can of tomatoes and bread slice could become something worth sitting down to eat properly. The tomato had to be warm from the garden, not the refrigerator, never the store, and sliced thick enough that the juice ran down your wrist when you bit into the sandwich. 2 slices of soft white bread, a heavy spread of mayonnaise, thick rounds of a tomato still holding the heat of the afternoon sun, and enough salt to make the flavor crack open. This was lunch and sometimes supper across the entire American South, a meal so simple that writing it down felt insulting to the people who made it. Hellmann's, first mass-distributed in the 1920s, became the only acceptable brand. Using anything else was grounds for a kitchen argument that could last a whole summer. The sandwich existed only during tomato season. When the last vine died in September, it vanished, and no winter tomato from a grocery store could bring it back. Buttered noodles satisfied hunger with the simplest combination of starch, fat, and salt, asking nothing of the cook beyond boiling water. Seniors living alone during the 1960s and 70s kept boxes of egg noodles in their pantries for evenings when cooking felt like too much, but hunger insisted on attention. The noodles were boiled until tender, drained thoroughly, then returned to the warm pot where butter was added along with generous salt and pepper. The butter melted into warm pasta, coating each strand with glossy richness that tasted more indulgent than ingredients suggested. Some added dried parsley for color or grated cheese when budget allowed. The entire preparation took under 10 minutes and produced a bowl of comfort that filled empty stomachs without taxing limited energy. Buttered noodles were honest food that never pretended to be more than what they were. For seniors eating alone, this simple dish provided warmth on nights when elaborate cooking was impossible. Fried salt pork and milk gravy was the morning-to-night staple that sustained farming families through endless days of labor. Grandma would slice thick pieces of cured pork belly, fry them slowly in cast iron until the edges curled crispy and the fat rendered into liquid gold. The meat was set aside while she worked magic with that hot grease, whisking in flour until it turned golden brown, then pouring in fresh milk from the morning's milking. She stirred constantly until the gravy thickened into something creamy and rich, seasoned with nothing but pepper and instinct. This gravy was ladled over biscuits at breakfast, potatoes at dinner, cornbread at supper. The salt pork provided protein and fat that kept bodies warm through hay, baling, and tobacco cutting. It was never fancy, but it was filling and made entirely from ingredients the farm provided. The skill was in knowing exactly when the flour had cooked enough, when the gravy had reached perfect consistency. Knowledge that lived only in a grandmother's hands. Leftover pintos never went to waste in a mountain kitchen, not when you could mash them, shape them into patties, and fry them in a hot skillet until the outside turned crisp and the inside stayed soft and warm. Bean cakes were the second life of a pot of soup beans, made the day after the original meal when the beans had thickened overnight in the refrigerator or on the back of the stove. You mashed them with a fork, mixed in a handful of cornmeal or flour to hold them together, and fried them flat in bacon grease. During the Depression, when a 12-cent bag of dried pintos could feed a family for 3 days, bean cakes extended that to 4. The first day was soup beans with cornbread. The second day was bean cakes fried for supper. Nothing wasted, nothing thrown out. Every calorie pulled from that single bag of dried beans. The cornmeal crust gave them a crunch the original beans never had, and that crunch made it feel like a different meal entirely. Toast with bacon drippings carried the rich memory of breakfast into evening meals, using saved fat that thrifty households never discarded. During the 1940s through 70s, seniors understood that bacon grease collected in jars beside the stove was liquid gold for flavoring and spreading. A slice of bread was toasted until golden, then spread while warm with a thin layer of cooled drippings seasoned with salt from countless previous cookings. The fat melted slightly into warm bread, creating savory richness that satisfied hunger and stretched resources. Some seniors sprinkled their dripping toast with black pepper or topped it with tomato slices when gardens were producing. The flavor was deeply porky, slightly smoky, and wholly comforting to those who remembered when nothing edible was ever thrown away. This single slice often served as complete supper when appetites were small. Toast with bacon drippings represented waste-nothing kitchens where every ingredient served multiple purposes. Soup beans and cornbread was the Monday dinner that anchored countless rural weeks across Appalachia and the South. Grandma soaked dried pinto beans overnight, then simmered them all day with a ham bone saved from Sunday's dinner, letting the marrow and meat scraps infuse the broth with smoky richness. She added nothing but salt, pepper, and maybe an onion quartered and thrown in whole. The beans cooked until creamy, their liquid thickening into rich pot liquor prized as much as the beans themselves. Meanwhile, cornbread baked in a preheated cast iron skillet, its bottom forming a golden crust from the hot bacon grease coating the pan. The combination provided complete protein, stretching a single ham bone into meals for 8 or more. Grandma never timed anything. She knew the beans were done by their appearance, the cornbread ready by its smell. This meal required only patience and the accumulated wisdom of generations who survived on exactly this. Sawmill gravy got its name in the lumber camps of the late 1800s, where cooks fed crews of men using nothing but flour, grease, milk, and black pepper in quantities large enough to fill a washtub. The gravy was thick, pale, peppery, and poured over anything that held still: biscuits, toast, cornbread, fried potatoes. You started with a few spoonfuls of bacon drippings in a hot skillet, stirred in flour until it turned golden and smelled like toasted grain, then poured in milk slowly while scraping the bottom of the pan. The whole process took less than 10 minutes and fed a household for pennies. Some cooks called it bulldog gravy, and in the coal camps of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, it showed up at every meal: breakfast, dinner, and supper. Because the mines paid low and the company store charged high. The pepper had to bite. If you couldn't feel the pepper, the gravy wasn't finished. She made it by sound. The sizzle of flour hitting grease told her everything a recipe never could. Hot cereal with butter transformed humble oatmeal or cream of wheat into something almost luxurious on cold evenings. Seniors who grew up during the Depression understood that hot cereal stretched further than almost any other food, filling stomachs for pennies per serving. The cereal was cooked according to package directions, usually with water when milk needed stretching, then transferred to a bowl where a generous pat of butter was added along with salt rather than sugar. The butter melted into golden pools on the surface, adding richness that made plain grain taste almost decadent. Some seniors stirred everything together while others let the butter remain in patches, each spoonful offering different proportions of creamy and plain. This savory preparation was common among those who preferred evening meals without sweetness. Hot cereal with butter represented economy and comfort combined, asking almost nothing of the cook, while delivering warmth on evenings when loneliness felt sharpest. Leather britches and fatback was a winter survival dish that turned summer's green bean abundance into cold weather sustenance. Grandma would string fresh green beans on heavy thread during peak harvest, creating long garlands that hung from kitchen rafters to dry for weeks. By winter, these shriveled brown strips rattled like old leather when touched, giving them their peculiar name. To prepare them, she soaked handfuls overnight, then simmered them for hours with salted fatback that slowly melted its richness into the pot. The beans softened into something entirely different from fresh ones, chewy, concentrated, with a deep, earthy flavor that no canned vegetable could match. This dish required no measuring, just the knowledge of how much water to add and when the beans had reached the right tenderness. Families relied on leather britches when snow-covered gardens, and fresh vegetables existed only in memory. It was peasant food that tasted like Providence, requiring only patience and the accumulated wisdom of generations. Cornmeal mush was exactly what it sounded like. Cornmeal stirred slowly into boiling water until it thickened into a dense, porridge-like mass. But the real meal came the next morning, when the leftover mush had been poured into a loaf pan and left to set firm in the cold. You sliced it thick, laid the slices in a skillet with hot grease, and fried them until both sides turned golden and crisp, while the center stayed soft and creamy. Cherokee communities had been cooking cornmeal this way long before German-American settlers in the Appalachian foothills adopted the technique, a practice that showed up in household records from Western Virginia and the Carolinas as far back as the 1700s. Topped with sorghum syrup or a drizzle of honey, fried mush was breakfast and supper depending on the household, and the overnight wait was the whole secret. Fresh mush fell apart in the skillet. You had to let the cold do the work. Patience was the ingredient that never made it into the recipe. Milk toast was the quiet companion of countless evenings spent alone, a dish so simple it seemed too humble to call dinner. Yet for seniors watching every penny during the 1950s and 60s, this warm bowl delivered exactly what tired bodies needed. Stale bread was never wasted in those kitchens where thrift meant survival. Slices were toasted lightly, placed in a shallow bowl, and covered with warm milk heated with butter and a pinch of salt. The bread softened into something between solid and liquid, easy to eat for those with dental troubles or diminished appetites. Some added sugar or cinnamon when sweetness was needed. The cost was negligible since milk and bread were pantry constants, and preparation took barely 5 minutes. Milk toast carried memories of childhood sickbeds and mothers tending fevered children. For seniors eating alone, this bowl meant warmth without fuss and nourishment without pretense. Tomato gravy over biscuits was summer's answer to milk gravy, using the garden's overflow when fresh tomatoes hung heavy on the vine. Grandma would chop ripe tomatoes roughly, not measuring, just eyeing what the meal needed, then cook them down in bacon drippings until they broke apart into thick sauce. Sugar was added by the pinch to cut the acid, flour by the handful to thicken, salt and pepper by instinct alone. The gravy turned a beautiful sunset orange, chunky in some spots, smooth in others, depending entirely on how Grandma felt that morning. She spooned it hot over fresh buttermilk biscuits, the tomato juice soaking into the flaky layers. This dish appeared during tomato season only, when the garden produced faster than families could eat or preserve. There was no winter version, no substitute, just the brief window when homegrown tomatoes made this possible. The recipe died with the grandmothers who never wrote anything down, trusting their daughters would watch and remember. If salmon patties came from a factory can, leather britches came from the porch ceiling. Whole green beans, strung on thread and hung to dry in the open air until they shriveled into tough, leathery strips that could last through an entire winter without refrigeration. The Cherokee had been drying beans on rawhide cord for centuries before Appalachian settlers adopted the practice and renamed them leather britches for the way the dried pods looked like miniature trouser legs. You rehydrated them by soaking overnight, then simmered them low and slow with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock until the beans softened and the broth turned dark and smoky. Some mountain families called them shucky beans. Same method, different hollow, different name for the same memory. The dried beans developed a concentrated, almost umami depth that fresh green beans could never match, and the old women who strung them every August swore the flavor came from the mountain air itself. Nobody strings leather britches on the porch anymore. The taste of slow-dried August is gone with the hands that hung them. Creamed eggs on toast transformed breakfast ingredients into satisfying supper that cost almost nothing and came together in under 10 minutes. Seniors who survived the Depression understood that eggs were among the most affordable proteins, stretching further when combined with simple white sauce. The preparation began with melting butter in a saucepan, whisking in flour until smooth, then slowly adding milk while stirring until thickened. Hard-boiled eggs, already prepared and waiting in the refrigerator, were chopped and folded into this creamy base with salt and pepper. The mixture was spooned over buttered toast while still warm. The result was rich, filling, and deceptively elegant for something made from such humble ingredients. This dish fed widows and widowers across America during decades when eating alone meant cooking economically but eating well. The eggs provided protein while the toast gave substance, and the sauce made everything feel like someone had taken care. So Cracklin bread was cornbread elevated by the precious remnants of hog butchering when nothing from the animal went to waste. After rendering lard from pork fat, Grandma saved the crispy brown bits left behind, cracklings that tasted like concentrated pork flavor. She stirred them directly into cornbread batter made from cornmeal, buttermilk, and a little lard, creating something richer than plain cornbread could ever be. The cracklings softened slightly during baking, but kept enough chew to provide texture in every bite. Grandma knew exactly how many cracklings to add without measuring, adjusting for how much fat remained on them. This bread appeared only after hog killing, usually in late fall, making it a seasonal treasure that families anticipated all year. The technique required understanding pork fat, knowing when cracklings were ready, and trusting your eyes over any written measurement. It was knowledge that lived in doing, not reading, and it made ordinary cornbread extraordinary. When the nearest ocean was 500 miles away and fresh fish meant a creek full of catfish you didn't have time to catch, canned salmon was the answer. Salmon patties, canned salmon mixed with egg, cracker crumbs, and chopped onion, shaped into rounds and fried in a skillet, showed up on Friday supper tables across Appalachia and the rural South every week for decades. During the 1930s and 40s, a can of pink salmon cost less than 15 cents and provided enough protein to stretch across 2 meals for a family of 4. Coal mining families in West Virginia and eastern Kentucky relied on them because the company store stocked canned goods but rarely fresh meat. The patties fried best in a well-seasoned cast-iron skillet with enough grease to come halfway up the sides, and you pressed them thin so the edges went crisp while the center stayed moist. The smell of canned salmon frying on a Friday evening was so specific to these kitchens that catching a trace of it decades later could stop you cold in a grocery aisle. Peanut butter on crackers provided complete protein and staying power without requiring a single pot or pan. Seniors living on fixed incomes during the 1960s and 70s kept jars of peanut butter in their pantries as insurance against hunger. Saltines, graham crackers, or Ritz crackers served as the canvas for this thick, sticky spread that required some effort to eat, but rewarded patience with satisfaction. The peanut butter could be spread thin for economy, or thick for indulgence depending on the day's mood and the jar's remaining contents. Some seniors drizzled honey over their peanut butter crackers or added sliced banana when fruit was available. The combination of fat, protein, and carbohydrate kept blood sugar stable through long evenings. This meal required no cooking, no cleanup beyond a knife wiped clean, and no particular skill. Peanut butter on crackers represented pure practicality, transformed into genuine sustenance for people who understood that simple did not mean inadequate. Squirrel and gravy was the hunter's reward that turned small game into sustenance when store-bought meat was a luxury. Grandpa would bring home squirrels cleaned and ready, and Grandma would cut them into pieces, dredge them in seasoned flour, and fry them slowly in lard until golden brown and tender. The meat was removed while she made gravy in the same skillet, stirring flour into the drippings and adding milk until it thickened into something rich with wild flavor. Squirrel meat was darker than chicken, slightly gamey, but absolutely delicious when prepared by hands that knew what they were doing. The gravy stretched the meal, ladled over biscuits and rice to feed a family from just 2 or 3 small animals. This dish appeared throughout fall and winter when squirrels were fat and plentiful in the hickory groves. No recipe existed because none was needed. Country women knew how to fry meat and make gravy the way they knew how to breathe. It was survival cooking elevated to something genuinely delicious. These kitchens are quiet now, and the hands that made this food are gone. Which one of these are you still trying to get right?